World-changing massacres share a pattern. They happen when powerful forces believe they can act with impunity. They involve systematic killing, not spontaneous violence. And crucially, they generate evidence. Photographs, witness testimony, mass graves that can't be hidden forever. Some force the creation of genocide laws. Others prove those laws meant nothing without enforcement. A few happened specifically because the international community had promised protection, then abandoned that promise when it mattered. These aren't the largest massacres in history. They're the ones that altered what came after. They created legal precedents, shifted geopolitical alliances, and changed how nations justify, or refuse to justify, intervention. From chemical weapons dropped on Kurdish civilians to machete-wielding neighbors in Rwanda, these massacres revealed patterns of human brutality that couldn't be explained away as wartime chaos. They demanded accountability, even when that accountability took decades to arrive. In December 1937, Japanese forces entered Nanjing, the capital of the Republic of China, riding high after taking Shanghai. The Chinese military was in full retreat, and by December 13th, Nanjing fell. What followed over the next 6 weeks became one of the most brutal massacres in modern history. Between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers were killed. At least 20,000 cases of rape were documented, though the real number was likely far higher. The Japanese military went house to house, bayoneting civilians for practice, drowning families in the Yangtze River, and burying people alive. Women were raped by the thousands, often murdered immediately afterward. The brutality was so extreme that a Nazi businessman became one of the massacre's most important witnesses. John Raab, a member of the Nazi Party who worked for Siemens, helped establish the Nanking Safety Zone and sheltered over 200,000 people. He documented everything in detailed diaries and photographs. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A Nazi was so shocked by Japanese brutality that he spent weeks trying to save Chinese lives. Raab later wrote about witnessing Japanese soldiers using prisoners for bayonet practice and competing to see how many people they could behead. American missionaries and doctors also witnessed the atrocities, including Minnie Vautrin and Robert Wilson. At the time, Japanese newspapers ran stories about officers competing in killing contests, framing mass murder as a sporting achievement. The government denied any atrocities had occurred, a denial that continued for decades. When the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal convened after World War II, the rape of Nanjing became central evidence. General Iwani Matsui, who commanded Japanese forces during the massacre, was found guilty and executed in 1948. The tribunal established precedents that would later be used at Nuremberg and in modern war crimes courts. For the first time, an international court systematically prosecuted military leaders for crimes against civilian populations. Commanders could be held responsible for their troops' actions, even without directly ordering every killing. The combination of Western witnesses, photographic evidence, and detailed military records made denial nearly impossible, at least internationally. It set the template for how future atrocities would be investigated and prosecuted. In April and May 1940, in the Katyn forest near Smolensk, 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals simply disappeared. The Soviet Union had occupied eastern Poland the previous September after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact divided the country. When Soviet forces rolled in, they rounded up Poland's military elite, intellectuals, priests, and anyone who might resist Soviet control. Then, in the spring of 1940, they vanished. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, received orders to liquidate the Polish prisoners. Over several weeks, they were taken in small groups to locations like the Katyn forest, shot in the back of the head, and dumped into mass graves. The Soviets didn't just kill soldiers, they killed professors, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and priests. The goal was to decapitate Polish society. For 3 years, Nobody knew where these men had gone. Then, in 1943, the Germans discovered the mass graves. Nazi forces near Smolensk noticed suspicious mounds in the forest. When they started digging, they found layer after layer of bodies in Polish uniforms, all shot execution style. The Nazis immediately seized on the discovery for propaganda, inviting international investigators. The evidence was clear. The bodies had been buried for about 3 years, meaning they died in 1940 when the Soviets controlled the area. The Soviet Union immediately denied responsibility and launched a counter-narrative. They claimed the Germans had committed the massacre in 1941 and were now trying to blame the Soviets. Stalin's government produced fabricated evidence and coerced witnesses. The Western Allies faced an impossible choice. By 1943, the Soviet Union was crucial in fighting Nazi Germany. Roosevelt and Churchill both knew the Soviet explanation was almost certainly false, but they couldn't afford to alienate Stalin, so they publicly accepted the Soviet version. This continued for nearly 50 years. Even after World War II ended, the Katyn massacre remained officially unsolved. The Soviets maintained their story. Western governments quietly archived their evidence but didn't push the issue. Poland, now under Soviet control, wasn't allowed to investigate or even discuss it publicly. The truth finally emerged in 1990. Mikhail Gorbachev admitted that the NKVD had executed the Polish prisoners on Stalin's orders. The Soviet government released documents proving the massacre, including the original execution order signed by members of the Politburo. The Katyn massacre poisoned Soviet-Polish relations for generations. It demonstrated how easily atrocities could be covered up when powerful governments found it convenient. It showed that wartime alliances meant truth could be sacrificed for political necessity. The massacre itself was horrific, but the 50-year cover-up might have done even more damage to international trust and the possibility of real accountability for war crimes. During the Tet Offensive in January 1968, Communist forces seized the ancient Vietnamese capital of Hue and held it for 25 days. When South Vietnamese and American troops retook the city on March 3rd, they began finding bodies. Over the following months, somewhere between 2,800 and 6,000 civilians were discovered in mass graves. What happened during those 25 days remains one of the most controversial massacres of the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese brought lists, detailed lists of names, addresses, and occupations. South Vietnamese government officials, police officers, school teachers, Catholic priests, and intellectuals were systematically rounded up. Some were taken to improvised prisons. Others were marched out of the city and never seen again. The killings weren't random violence. They were organized purges. Some victims were found with their hands tied behind their backs, shot in the head. Others had been beaten to death or buried alive. One of the largest sites was discovered near Gia Hoi High School, where hundreds of bodies were unearthed. The discovery timeline stretched for months. Every few weeks, another grave would be excavated. Bodies were still being found years later. The massacre became politically complicated. The Hue killings were discovered right around the same time that details about the My Lai massacre were emerging. The U.S. military and South Vietnamese government immediately began using Hue as a counter-narrative. Look what the communists do, they argued. The propaganda value was obvious, which made some people skeptical about the numbers. The North Vietnamese denied everything. According to their version, any civilian deaths were caused by American bombing and artillery. Some communist sources acknowledged that puppet officials were tried and executed for crimes against the people, but insisted these were legitimate revolutionary justice actions, not massacres. Multiple Western journalists and humanitarian workers documented the graves. Catholic priests who survived testified about systematic killings. The physical evidence, bodies with bound hands and execution-style gunshot wounds, contradicted claims of bombing casualties. Even accounting for propaganda inflation, thousands clearly died in targeted killings. The Hue massacre had lasting effects on how Americans viewed the Vietnam War, though not in the way the U.S. government hoped. For some, it justified continued involvement. For others, it was evidence that the war had brutalized everyone involved, that atrocities were being committed by all sides. The fact that it was used as propaganda to counter revelations about American atrocities made it hard to process objectively. To this day, the exact death toll is disputed. The Vietnamese government still denies that a massacre occurred. No one has been prosecuted. For a massacre that killed thousands and was extensively documented, it remains remarkably obscure in historical memory, overshadowed by other atrocities and muddied by its use as Cold War propaganda. Between September 16th and 18th, 1982, somewhere between 800 and 3,500 Palestinian refugees and Lebanese Shia were killed in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Beirut. The massacres occurred under Israeli military floodlights, in camps surrounded by Israeli forces. The killers were Christian Falangist militiamen. But the question of who was responsible became one of the most divisive issues in Israeli politics. Israel had invaded Lebanon in June 1982 to push back the Palestine Liberation Organization. By August, a deal was negotiated. PLO fighters would evacuate, and Palestinian civilians in the refugee camps would be protected by international peacekeepers. The PLO fighters left. Then the peacekeepers left too, weeks earlier than planned. On September 14th, Lebanese President-elect Bashir Gemayel was assassinated. The Phalangists blamed Palestinians. Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon immediately ordered forces to enter West Beirut. By September 15th, Israeli troops had surrounded Sabra and Shatila, sealing all exits. That evening, Israeli commanders allowed approximately 150 Phalangist militiamen to enter the camps to search for PLO fighters. Israeli forces controlled the perimeter and set up floodlights to illuminate the camps at night so operations could continue after dark. Over the next 48 hours, the Phalangists went house to house, killing men, women, and children. Victims were shot, stabbed, bludgeoned, and mutilated. Women were raped before being killed. Bodies were bulldozed into mass graves or left in the streets. Israeli soldiers at the perimeter could hear gunfire and screams. Officers received reports about mass killings but didn't intervene. The floodlight stayed on through both nights. The killings continued until September 18th, when international journalists and Red Cross workers finally gained access. They found bodies everywhere. The exact death toll was never determined. Palestinian sources claimed over 3,000 dead. Israeli sources suggested closer to 800. International investigations settled on estimates between 2,000 and 3,500. The international reaction was fierce. On September 25th, 400,000 Israelis demonstrated in Tel Aviv demanding an investigation, the largest protest in Israeli history at the time. The Kahan Commission found that while Israeli forces didn't directly participate, they bore indirect responsibility. Ariel Sharon was found personally responsible for failing to prevent the massacre. The commission recommended his dismissal. Sharon resigned as defense minister but remained in government and later became prime minister in 2001. The massacre strengthened arguments for responsibility to protect doctrines. It created precedents about command responsibility when Allied forces commit atrocities with your knowledge or support. The floodlights became a symbol. You can claim you didn't know, but when you're literally illuminating the killing ground, that claim rings hollow. In July 1995, in a UN-declared safe area guarded by Dutch peacekeepers, over 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys were systematically executed. The Srebrenica massacre wasn't just a failure of protection. It was the complete collapse of the international community's promise that genocide would never happen again. and it happened while UN forces watched. By 1993, the UN had established 6 safe areas where Bosnian civilians could take refuge. Srebrenica was one of them. Around 40,000 refugees had fled there, protected by roughly 400 lightly armed Dutch soldiers. On July 11, 1995, Bosnian Serb forces under General Ratko Mladic attacked. The Dutch peacekeepers were outgunned. They requested NATO air support. It didn't come in time. By the end of the day, Serb forces had taken control. What happened next was methodical genocide. Bosnian Serb forces began separating military-age men and boys from women, children, and elderly. They claimed the men would be screened for war crimes, then released. The women and children were bussed out. The men were taken to warehouses, schools, and fields. Between July 11th and July 22nd, approximately 8,000 men and boys were executed. Men were lined up and shot in groups, their bodies dumped into mass graves. Some graves contained hundreds of bodies. Survivors later testified about being forced to watch others die before being shot themselves and left for dead under piles of corpses. The Serbs later returned with heavy equipment to dig up the mass graves and move bodies to secondary and tertiary burial sites, trying to hide the evidence. This actually helped investigators. DNA from scattered remains could be matched across multiple sites, proving the bodies had been moved and making denial nearly impossible. The aftermath was catastrophic for UN credibility. The Dutch government eventually resigned. UN officials faced intense criticism. The peacekeepers had been sent to protect civilians with inadequate resources and no real plan for what to do if seriously challenged. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia made Srebrenica a central focus. In 2001, Radislav Krstić became the first person convicted of genocide in Europe since World War II. Mladic was arrested in 2011 and convicted in 2017, sentenced to life. The trials established crucial precedents about command responsibility and what constitutes genocide. The identification process became the most extensive forensic operation in history. As of now, 8,322 victims have been positively identified through DNA matching. Each July 11th, newly identified victims are buried in a memorial cemetery. Families still bring remains for burial decades later. Srebrenica directly led to the development of the responsibility to protect doctrine. Whether that doctrine has teeth is debatable, but Srebrenica made it impossible to claim ignorance about what happens when protection promises aren't backed by actual force. The safe zone became a killing ground, and the peacekeepers could only watch. Between April 7th and mid-July 1994, in just 100 days, roughly 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed in Rwanda, mostly by machete, by neighbors who knew their names. The Rwanda genocide was the fastest mass killing in modern history and a case study in how the international community can watch genocide happen in real time and deliberately choose to do nothing. Belgian colonialism created rigid ethnic classifications. Tutsis received identity cards and privileges. Hutus, 85% of the population, were marginalized. When Belgium left in 1962, they flipped the power structure, putting Hutus in charge. Decades of resentment built on both sides. On April 6, 1994, a plane carrying Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana was shot down. Both presidents aboard died. Within hours, the genocide began. This wasn't spontaneous. Hutu extremists had been stockpiling machetes and creating lists of targets. Radio station RTLM had been broadcasting violent propaganda, referring to Tutsis as cockroaches and calling for their extermination. Roadblocks went up throughout Kigali. Interahamwe militia members, along with soldiers and police, began going door to door. Militiamen checked identity cards at roadblocks, pulling out anyone classified as Tutsi. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Churches became death traps. One church in Nyamata had over 5,000 people killed in a single day. The speed was staggering. Roughly 8,000 people were being killed every single day. That's faster than the Nazi Holocaust's killing rate. Most victims were killed with machetes, clubs, or agricultural tools because bullets were considered too expensive. Rivers became clogged with bodies. The Kagera River carried so many corpses that Uganda had to issue health warnings about contaminated water. The UN already had peacekeepers in Rwanda. UNAMIR had about 2,500 troops when the genocide started. Their commander, Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, sent desperate cables begging for reinforcements and authorization to intervene. Instead, the UN Security Council voted to reduce the force to just 270 troops. They pulled out most peacekeepers right when they were needed most. The United States actively avoided using the word genocide. State Department memos show officials were instructed to say acts of genocide may have occurred rather than calling it genocide outright. Why? Because under the 1948 Genocide Convention, acknowledging genocide creates an obligation to intervene. By dancing around the terminology, the U.S. avoided legal responsibility. President Clinton later admitted this was one of his biggest regrets. France eventually launched Operation Turquoise in late June, establishing a safe zone. It saved some lives, but France was accused of helping Hutu perpetrators escape rather than stopping the genocide. The genocide ended when Paul Kagame's RPF forces captured Kigali on July 4th. But by then, 800,000 people were dead. Another 2 million Hutus fled to refugee camps, fearing reprisals. Those camps sparked the Congo Wars, which killed millions more. Rwanda revived Gacaca courts, a traditional community justice system, to process roughly 120,000 accused perpetrators. It was imperfect, but processed tens of thousands of cases that would have otherwise never been tried. The Rwanda genocide destroyed any remaining credibility the phrase "never again" had. The international community had all the warning signs, real-time information, and legal obligations to act. They chose not to. 800,000 people died in 100 days because intervention was politically inconvenient. On March 16, 1988, the Iraqi Air Force dropped chemical weapons on the Kurdish town of Halabja, killing approximately 5,000 civilians in hours. Victims died in the streets mid-stride. Families were found dead in basements where they'd tried to shelter. The Halabja chemical attack was the largest chemical weapons attack against a civilian population in history, and it fundamentally changed how the world thinks about chemical warfare. The attack happened during the Iran-Iraq War. Saddam Hussein's regime was conducting the Anfal campaign to suppress Kurdish populations suspected of collaborating with Iran. Halabja, near the Iranian border, had recently been captured by Iranian forces with Kurdish help. Iraq wanted it back. On the morning of March 16th, Iraqi planes appeared and began dropping bombs. At first, residents thought it was conventional bombing, but these bombs released clouds of gas that spread through the streets, into homes, down into basements. The attack used a mix of chemical agents, mustard gas, sarin, VX nerve agent, and probably cyanide. People died almost instantly. The gases attacked the respiratory system, the nervous system, the skin. Victims showed chemical burns, blindness, vomiting, and respiratory failure. Those who tried to flee collapsed. Those who stayed in basements died from gases heavier than air that sank to the lowest points. Entire families were found dead together. Iranian and Kurdish journalists arrived within days and documented what they found. The most famous photograph, taken by Iranian photographer Ramazan Öztürk, shows a dead father still clutching his infant child, both killed by the gas. The photographs were shocking enough that they eventually reached Western media. The immediate death toll was roughly 5,000 people, but survivors suffered from respiratory problems, skin diseases, cancers, and birth defects. By some estimates, an additional 7,000 to 10,000 people died from complications over the following years. Children born to survivors showed higher rates of birth defects. The initial Western reaction was muted. In 1988, Iraq was considered an ally by many Western nations because it was fighting Iran. Some U.S. officials suggested Iran might have been responsible. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, the Reagan administration was more focused on preventing an Iranian victory than holding Iraq accountable. It wasn't until after Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990 that Halabja was reframed. Suddenly, the chemical attack became evidence of Saddam Hussein's brutality. The same governments that had been silent in 1988 were citing it in 1991 and 2003 as justification for military action. The massacre was real, but its political use was cynical. Ali Hassan al-Majid, Saddam's cousin, became known as Chemical Ali for his willingness to use chemical weapons. After the fall of Saddam's regime, al-Majid was captured, tried, and convicted of genocide. He was executed in 2010. Halabja strengthened the Chemical Weapons Convention, creating verification regimes and inspection protocols. It established chemical weapons use as a red line that could justify international intervention. This red line was tested in Syria in 2013, when Assad used chemical weapons. President Obama had called it a red line that would trigger American intervention. When Assad crossed it, the response was inconsistent and ultimately ineffective, proving that red lines only matter when nations are willing to enforce them. On March 16, 1968, American soldiers entered the Vietnamese village of My Lai expecting to find Viet Cong fighters. Instead, they found unarmed civilians going about their morning routines. Over the next 4 hours, soldiers from Charlie Company killed approximately 500 villagers, mostly women, children, and elderly men. My Lai became the defining atrocity of the Vietnam War because one photograph and one whistleblower made it impossible to ignore. The context was Operation Cedar Falls in Quang Ngai Province. American forces were frustrated with guerrilla warfare. Intelligence suggested My Lai was a Viet Cong stronghold. Charlie Company, led by Lieutenant William Kelly, was ordered to destroy it. When the soldiers arrived, they encountered no resistance. No weapons were found. The villagers were preparing breakfast. It didn't matter. Kelly's platoon began systematically killing everyone. Families were herded into ditches and shot. Women were raped before being killed. Homes were burned. The operation was thorough and methodical. Helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson tried to stop it. Flying reconnaissance overhead, he noticed something wrong. He saw bodies in ditches, civilians running from American soldiers, wounded people being shot at close range. He landed his helicopter between fleeing villagers and advancing soldiers, ordering his crew chief to open fire on the Americans if they tried to shoot the civilians. Thompson evacuated about a dozen villages and reported the massacre. The initial army report claimed 128 Viet Cong killed in combat. The truth stayed buried for over a year. Then Ron Riddenhauer, a soldier who had heard rumors, started writing letters to Congress, the Pentagon, and the White House. Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh picked up the story and broke it publicly in November 1969. The timing was devastating. Anti-war sentiment was already high. My Lai became evidence that something fundamental had broken in American military conduct. This wasn't combat stress. It was a deliberate, sustained massacre over several hours, with officers participating. Army photographer Ronald Habeler had documented the massacre. His images showed bodies piled in ditches, terrified villagers moments before being shot. The images were so graphic that some newspapers refused to print them. Others ran them on front pages. 26 soldiers were charged. Only William Kelly was convicted. He was found guilty of murdering 22 civilians and sentenced to life in prison. President Nixon intervened, reducing the sentence to house arrest. Kelly served 3.5 years. A Gallup poll showed 79% of Americans disagreed with the guilty verdict. The reaction revealed deep divisions. Some saw Kelly as a war criminal. Others saw him as a scapegoat following orders. Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter declared an American Fighting Man's Day in support of Kelly. Hugh Thompson, the pilot who stopped the killing, received death threats. Some congressmen called him a traitor. It took 3 decades for him to receive recognition. My Lai accelerated the collapse of public support for the war. It contributed to ending the draft. It created the Vietnam Syndrome, a deep reluctance to commit American forces abroad that lasted for decades. Today, My Lai has a peace park and museum. The site includes a memorial listing victims' names. American veteran groups have visited to offer apologies. But in the United States, My Lai remains politically contested. The massacre demonstrated that cover-ups only work until someone with a conscience decides to speak. Only one man was convicted among dozens of participants. He served less than 4 years. Whether it actually changed anything about how future wars would be conducted remains an open question.